see people joining in. Okay, I'm going to get us started because we are now on time. Hi, my name is Jeff Abramson. I'm the director of the Forum on the Arms Trade, and it's great to see so many people coming in. If you need interpretation into Spanish, that's available at the bottom. Si quiere interpretación, hay un botón en el fondo. The Forum on the Arms Trade is happy to partner uh, to host this event with Global Exchange. The Forum on the Arms Trade is itself a network of professionals who work on civil society professionals who work on arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues, the implications of those. We are actually this month celebrating our 10th anniversary, which is exciting for us to do. Originally starting with 6 listed experts, we now have more than almost 200 experts and emerging experts listed on our website as part of our community. And over the past few years, have done a number of events related to this topic, but I'm really excited to bring some other voices into this conversation as well. There's one more event in our series that's on a different topic tomorrow, but if you'd like to join in, it's on recommendations for the next U.S. president and Congress. But today we're here to talk about the U.S. border, understanding the guns and immigration link. I'm here to tell you a little bit about the technology we'll use. I know many of us, or all of us, have spent many times on a Zoom webinar. We would love to make this interactive, so the chat function is available. Everybody here, including the audience, can use the chat. Please keep it respectful. It's a diverse audience that we have today. We will be looking as panelists at the Q&A. So if you have a question, please do place that in the Q&A, and you can all see each other's questions, and you can upvote the questions so we know which ones you're most interested in. That will help us when we do get to the Q&A portion. And at the end, there will be a survey. I haven't translated that into Spanish, so it's an English language survey, but it's very short to give us some feedback on this event, which we'd very much like to have. And with that, not talking about the substance, just the technology, I want to turn it over to our moderator, Christina Delgado, who is the Southwest Regional Advocacy Associate at the Community Justice Action Fund. Christina and I have connected in the last few days, but Christina, I think we actually have met in Washington, D.C. when you were here. So let me ask you to turn your video on and get us started. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you all for joining us today, taking the time to engage in this conversation, very important conversation. So as Jeff said, I am Christina Delgado. I am a 4th generation Tejana, born and raised in Houston, Texas. I'm the oldest of 3 daughters, a mother of 2 beautiful daughters, coming from a gun-owning family. But I'm also someone who's been affected by gun violence in multiple capacities in my life. In the 5th grade, I had a friend who was shot and survived a drive-by shooting that was intended for his brother. I've lost friends to domestic violence by a gun. In that time, as a young child, as the acts of violence and the occurrences of violence continued in our community, you know, my parents thankfully put everything aside to make sure that they could find a better place for us with more resources, better education, you know, better mental health support, because they knew that it was an issue. They knew that it was affecting myself and my young sisters. April 20th of 1999, I remember watching in horror my junior year as the Columbine shooting occurred. And I just thought to myself, this really cannot be real. It was an insane thing to have to see these students, these young people being gunned down, running for their lives, attempting to save each other. And I remember sitting with my mother on her couch in our house as a young teen, you know, asking, how could this happen? So fast forward to May 18th of 2018, here in my home in Santa Fe, my daughter oldest was a 7th grader. My youngest was at the elementary school. I got a phone call from a friend of mine, and she told me of a rumor of an active shooter. I thought to myself, it really couldn't be real because things like that don't happen here in Texas. As a young person who grew up with a gun-owning family, you know, I've really felt that people acted responsibly. Unfortunately, because of access to firearms, a 17-year-old took his father's shotgun and gunned down 8 students and 2 teachers in the art rooms at Santa Fe High. I found myself outside of that school looking for children, seeing the carnage, seeing parents finding out that their children were no longer here. And it really struck me to have my daughter sitting on my couch in my home, crying and asking me how I was going to protect her. I started advocating for gun violence prevention, intervention measures, and supporting survivors that following year in 2019. So to my dismay, to see a community with parents that look like me and children that look like mine, just 4 years later in Uvalde, have to stand in the same place we did, asking the same questions we did, but to be met not with humility and grace as we were in Santa Fe, but to be met with resistance, to be met with brutality. It was very shocking and concerning for me. And it was in that moment, in seeing the disparities and how this neighboring community was being treated in comparison to a primarily Caucasian community, a very conservative community, was what brought me to this work with community justice. Just a little bit about community justice. We are a national organization really focusing on the root cause, identifying the root causes of acts of violence that happen every day in our Black and Brown communities, ensuring that we have proper wraparound services for individuals, access to resources, access to mental health, and access to community support to ensure that when these acts of violence occur, we have the ability as a community to come together to break those cycles of violence from happening. One thing that I think that we really need to look at is when these acts of violence are happening throughout our country, in our neighborhoods, our first line of defense is, how do I protect my family? What are the root causes? Access to firearms is the utmost reason we have these acts of gun violence that are occurring. What you're going to hear today from experts is really going to be bringing truth to light in so many conversations that we have had across the country, across the world, on increases of violence, not only here in our United States, but for our brothers and sisters below the border. We do know that the United States is one of the largest manufacturers and sellers of firearms, especially in North America. And we do know that we have the ability as communities, as a country, to put things in place to help us curb these acts of violence of happening and curb the access to firearms. So we will definitely get started. You're going to hear from some amazing panelists today. And we will also be absolutely happy to continue this communication. If you guys have questions that you feel are very important, please put them in the Q&A, as Jeff had said. And we really look forward to continuing this conversation throughout this next hour. So next, I am going to introduce John Lindsay-Poland, who is the coordinator of Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico.
Thank you so much, Christina. I was going to be speaking after Laura, but I'm going to present you all with some data regarding the flow of firearms, the trafficking of firearms from the United States, not just to Mexico, but also to the Caribbean and Central American countries. We received, I coordinate a project called Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico, which is a project of global exchange. We do research, advocacy, and binational organizing and networking in order to stop the flow of illicit firearms, but also legal firearms that are causing such havoc in so many communities throughout our region. And we've obtained data from the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, that's very detailed about where firearms that are being trafficked are coming from. You'll hear from Laura about people who are arriving at the U.S. border. And over the last year, several years, many of those people have been coming from Haiti, where there is havoc being caused by firearms, especially rifles that are being trafficked from Florida. Haiti is the only country that for 4 years in a row has had a growing number of people seeking asylum arriving at the U.S. Mexico border. And so where are those firearms coming from? I'm going to show you some maps here, some information based on the data that we received. So this is a map of where the zip codes from which firearms were trafficked to 6 different Caribbean countries and traced back to their purchase within the United States. If we take a closer look, we'll see also that in Florida, particularly in southern Florida, also in Orlando and in the Atlanta area, there is just an enormous flow of firearms. And a lot of that has to do with the firearms laws in Florida, which permit the sale of assault rifles at 50 caliber rifles without a background check, other very lax laws, and an enormous number of firearms dealers. So this one zip code was the source of nearly 200 firearms that were traced back from finds in the Caribbean. But that's just a small portion of the firearms that are being recovered, and even a smaller portion of those that are being trafficked. If we turn our attention to Mexico, we know that firearms that are recovered within a year of their being purchased were almost certainly being purchased in order to traffic them. And we find that over the last 9 years, the number of firearms that are traced within a year of being purchased has grown fourfold, from less than 400 in 2015 to an annualized rate of nearly 600, over 600 in this past year. That's indicating that the amount of weapons that are being trafficked over the border is growing enormously. And then I want to show one other thing, which is that we've known for a long time that Texas and Arizona are principal sources of firearms that are being trafficked to Mexico, which is making migration for those who are seeking asylum from anywhere, Mexico or any other country, very dangerous. And increasingly, those weapons are coming from Arizona. So the green portion in this graph shows the firearms that had a short time to crime, a short period of time between the purchase and the recovery in Mexico. In Arizona, that they were purchased in Arizona, that portion is growing to the extent that this past year, at least in the first 7 months of the year, the majority of weapons that had a short period of time between purchase and recovery came from Arizona. So traffickers are looking to Arizona. They're going to Arizona in order to traffic weapons. And a lot of that, again, is because firearms laws in Arizona are extremely lax. There's a very large number of firearms dealers. It's very easy to get firearms that are assault rifles or other weapons that are desired by organized crime. And then it's very easy to traffic them over the border. So we can talk more about that in a few moments, but I wanted to just share that data for people to see at the outset.
Thank you so much, John. And we'll definitely, I see that some folks are putting some questions in the chat, which is great. We'll try and I'll try and answer some of those. I think some of the panelists will try to answer as well, but we may save some of those for the end of our session. So please continue to listen, engage. And next, we will have Lara Vargas, the assistant professor of the Department of Psychiatry at University of Colorado School of Medicine. Lara, take it away.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for sharing your story. I've heard it before, but it's such a wonderful, I mean, it's such an impactful story, and it's such an American story, right? I really am thankful for your words. I'm Laura Vargas. My research focuses, it's NIH-funded research focused on understanding exposure to trauma and mental health among newly arrived immigrants from Latin America. So I'll tell you a little bit about the study. I'll tell you a little bit about what we find so far in terms of the link with firearm violence and migration. So as many of you know, Latin America is the most violent region in the world. 8% of the world's population, but more than a third of the world's homicides occur in Latin America. And it's not a coincidence that this is the most violent region in the world when the United States is the largest exporter and producer of firearms worldwide. Firearms, sadly, are now the leading cause of death for children and youth, not just in the United States, but also in Brazil, in Mexico, and it's trending that way in Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States, but it's a sad development. So I want to talk a little bit before I get to our actual study. I want to talk about how the firearms shape the environment that people live in, right? So guns are proliferate, very prolific throughout the region, and throughout the region there's rampant criminal activity with drug trafficking organizations. There's territorial disputes between these drug trafficking organizations, but also there's a lot of complicity and corruption within local law enforcement organizations. And all of this leads to just sort of a widespread effect for all of society, where there is unchecked crimes like extortion, like robbery. And then, of course, there's a trafficking of drugs, but also of people, and then the trafficking of firearms from the United States to the region, which facilitates all of these other very, very profitable illegal activities. And of course, there's a lot of impunity and there's a lack of trust, right? And so when there is this environment, it doesn't just have an effect of the firearm causing a harm. The widespread violence also has impacts for investments. Foreign investment doesn't want to come to a country that's more dangerous. And so that has a downstream effect of not creating jobs and lowering economic opportunity. Children have unsafe environments to go to school in, and many of them stop going to school, or the schools themselves become dangerous and they have to close down. And so the opportunity for both development and economic growth within the region is very strongly impacted by the presence and availability of so many firearms that are coming from the United States, right? So it's not just the act of shooting a weapon and hurting somebody, right? It's all of the downstream effects that come from that. So there's these negative social and economic impacts that essentially also paint a lack of future for families and children that then also cause migration, right? So our sample, so far we've recruited 320 participants, and they come from 14 different countries. 2/3 of our sample have been women. And of those women, 22% of our total female sample are pregnant women. So 48 women have been pregnant in our sample. And this is not a journey that is an easy one for pregnant women to take, right? So there's a lot of really different factors that go into why people decide to migrate, but violence is the main factor. 45% of our sample tells us that the main reason for leaving their country is because of forced migration. 78% of them are traveling with children. Most folks, about 57% of our sample comes from from Central America. 35% comes from South America, but then we have a sizable portion of people coming from the Caribbean and Mexico as well, as John pointed. And I guess one of the things that's important to highlight is that people encounter the violence in their home country, and that's a reason for migration. But then they encounter the violence on their way to the United States as well, right? We wrote a paper about exposure to firearm threats among this sample. 48% of our sample has been threatened with a firearm, and that's a lot. And so I've had people tell me, who come across the Darien Gap, that they would sadly much rather cross the Darien Gap than cross through Mexico, right? Because it's so dangerous. And this kind of speaks to the point that John was bringing up about how the whole region is just sort of shaped by these firearms and by this huge market and demand for these weapons that produce a lot of money in illicit markets. So a few of the other types of traumatic experiences that people go through, 72% of our sample has been extorted or robbed. The average amount of extortion that people pay is about $800 per person, which is a lot of money. As I said, 48% of our sample has been threatened with a firearm. 53% of our sample has witnessed a shooting of other people amongst each other. 52% have been exposed to frequent gunfire. 51% have lost a family member or a friend due to violence. And about a third of the sample has been exposed to combat-like situations. And again, Latin America is not a place where there are any war zones, official war zones or civil conflicts, but there are warlike conditions for many of these people. Women, sadly, are more likely than men to be exposed to sexual violence, both in their home country and throughout the journey. And then there's just all sorts of very tragic downstream effects that happen of witnessing violence for a lot of these families, right? People, as I said, 78% of our participants travel with their kids. The kids are along with them when they witness people being shot, people being extorted, people being robbed. So all of these things have a very, very large impact. So I will keep it there, and I will address some of the mental health issues in our second round. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara. And you bring up some really important facts that I think that we should all, kind of take note of, are these ripple effects that happen when youth, when individuals, when families experience the trauma of being affected by gun violence, either themselves being a victim or having to say goodbye to their loved ones. These ripple effects then, kind of begin and, continue these cycles of violence that affect all of our communities, not just those families that are directly affected, but those surrounding them, those who love and support them. So just wanted to make sure that, we reiterate that it's not just that moment of violence. There's so much more that comes with that, and so many more people affected. So thank you so much for all of your work, Lara. So next we are going to have Jonathan Lowy. He is the president of Global Action on Gun Violence. John, thank you so much for being with us, and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Christina. And I'm going to speak about what causes this problem of gun violence in Mexico and throughout the region. Now, Mexico has 1 to 2 gun stores in the entire country. Mexico and most other countries in the world have very tight gun laws that make it very difficult for criminals or really anyone to obtain guns without a really clear reason and justification. Yet there's this massive gun violence problem. And the reason is because of the conduct of the gun industry in the United States. And let me explain briefly how that happens and what Mexico is doing in the courts that I'm involved with to address that problem. Almost all crime guns in the United States and that are trafficked from the United States are sold by a very small percentage of gun dealers. About 90% of gun dealers in the United States sell no crime guns in a given year. Yet about 5% of gun dealers in the US sell about 90% of the crime guns. So you've got this fairly small percentage that are responsible for virtually the whole problem. And many of these crime guns are sold through blatantly reckless and, in my view, illegal practices. And to be concrete about how it happens with guns that are trafficked to Mexico, what often happens is the cartels in Mexico either recruit or work with a gun trafficker who will go into a gun store, often in Arizona or Texas, as John Lindsay-Poland explained, and buy significant numbers of guns, often repeatedly, go into the gun store and maybe buy 3, 4, 5 assault rifles, maybe come back a few weeks later or a month later and buy another, thousands of dollars worth of guns, often all in cash. These are not ordinary buying practices. And gun manufacturers, for their standpoint, have known for well over 20 years that the problem is these bad acting gun dealers engaging in these irresponsible practices. And the manufacturers have been told to stop supplying these bad dealers, stop allowing these dangerous practices, and they have refused. And they have because they make money off the criminal market. So Mexico, and myself, my organization, Global Action on Gun Violence, working with Mexico, took action in the courts to try to stop this problem. They brought a lawsuit against the major gun manufacturers in the United States, saying that what they're doing is negligent, it's unreasonable, and it's also illegal. And that suit is making its way through the courts. We won a decision in the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which held that Mexico could proceed with its case and overcome what is an obstacle in holding gun companies accountable in the United States, which is a federal protection law that Congress enacted in 2005 called the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, which gives the gun industry some special protections from civil liability. The First Circuit held that that law does not prevent Mexico's lawsuit because what Mexico alleges is that the manufacturers violate federal law, and that is not protected by this statute. That issue is now before the United States Supreme Court, which has taken review of that case, and that is actively being briefed right now. I'm spending a lot of my time involved in it, and the case will be argued in the Supreme Court on March 4th, and then we expect a decision to come from the Supreme Court most likely in June of this year. And maybe in the follow-up, I can go into some more detail about the legal issues. We think we're on the right side. We think these are strong arguments. We also think even with this Supreme Court, with its conservative tendencies, we think these are arguments that can and should win even before this court. And I will say that if Mexico prevails in this lawsuit, and there's also another lawsuit that we're involved in representing Mexico against gun dealers in Arizona that's under a similar theory. And if Mexico is successful, obviously Mexico will be a great beneficiary of this. I mean, this will hold gun companies accountable, put a price on their conduct of supplying the crime gun market, and also potentially get injunctive relief, that is, court orders requiring these gun companies to act more responsibly and legally. But if that happens, actually, the United States will be an even greater beneficiary than Mexico, because while in Mexico, 70 to 90% of their crime guns are sold in the US and then trafficked, in the United States, about 100% of the guns that are used commit violence are from the US gun industry, US sales. And if those sales practices are reformed, it will greatly reduce gun violence in the US, Mexico, and in the Caribbean. And that's the point behind these lawsuits. So I can wrap up here and happy to go into more detail and answer questions as we go on.
Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. It's been really enlightening to be able to get so much more of this information and this data, because it's really important. So I definitely want us to have a chance to, continue the conversation and answer some of your questions in the chat. And I think this will open it up for us to have, more of a conversation from the panelists as well. With all of this that we were able to get from our experts, one of the main questions that always comes up is, well, what do we do? What can we do about, the violence that's happening, domestic violence, gun violence, the effects? And a lot of that comes with exactly what we're doing now. Holding space for these conversations to be able to share experiences, share knowledge, and to educate those around us, especially those decision makers, not just in our communities on the ground, but within our families, those elected officials, and those representatives at the federal level. That have the ability to create safeguards that give us a better direction of how we can function when we're dealing with negligence, when we're dealing with trying to get accountability. So finding organizations such as all of ours and so many others that are across the country, some state-based, some national-based, finding coalitions, finding those those events that are in person, and being able to meet with those individuals to continue the conversation. Very, very recently, what we are about to, have to deal with, that I know that those of us working in community violence on the ground, in communities that serve diverse areas, but also those areas, urban areas that have an influx of these migrants, is the effects of what may or may not happen with these mass deportations. A lot of this has become very, the fuel to that fire is the rhetoric that is not 100% true. As Lara was able to give us some of that information, and Jonathan and John as well, that these are not individuals who are choosing violence every day. These are individuals who are doing exactly what my parents did when I was younger, exactly what I am doing with my girls, to try to mitigate their experiences with the same acts of violence that I did, and unfortunately what they themselves have already had to experience. So that is one of the things that I highly recommend to everyone, is definitely finding organizations there in your home states. We have multiple organizations here in the state of Texas. We have a Texas Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence through Texas Gun Sense. So definitely we can maybe compile a list and send it out to everyone as a follow-up. I did see a let me go back through these. You guys have put some really great questions in here. Let's see. I think this is one that I think would be really interesting, Lara and John and Jonathan, if you guys have an answer for this. Is the mainstream reason behind this money, or is it power, control, or gangs? What is that root cause that you all have found in your data and your research to possibly be one of these root causes as to why the trafficking is happening, why the migration, and why the increase in violence?
I don't know, Johnny, you were going to go ahead, but I would say, I often say it's a cocktail of issues, right? Because you have the xenophobia and racism that is sort of the foundation for a lot of migration policy that is about, well, we have to just keep these people out. You have the fascination and the history with guns and the sort of domination. You have the misogyny that where guns are being purchased and used to dominate women within households. You have a drug issue of people using drugs and not really dealing with the addictions that are the reason why people are using fentanyl, and instead externalizing that problem to say, oh, we have to go after the fentanyl producers, but then not recognizing the ways in which guns are empowering all of those problems. And you have people who are being turned back to, say, northern Mexico over the border. They're being deported from the United States into situations where criminal organizations will use the presence of people who are seeking asylum, who cannot go back to their home countries, but have some kind of link in the United States in order to extort them. And it's perfect for the business model of the criminal organizations. That combination, right, of drug trafficking, migration, xenophobic migration policy, and a gun market that is feeding all of these. So you can look at root causes at the individual level. I tend to look at them more at the policy and economic level and see lots of different ways in which the history and policies and interests of some groups are contributing to this flow and this making life unsustainable for people in so many communities.
And I just add to that, the money and the power. And for the money, the gun industry makes profit off any guns that are sold. So to them, if it's their guns and it's 10 guns that are sold to an obvious gun trafficker working for the cartels, that's the same profit as, guns sold to people who are law abiding, law enforcement, military. So there is that significant profit motive for the gun industry to have relaxed laws that enable them to get away with this. And then on the power side, guns are one of the most potent single issues in American politics. And so it makes political sense for some people to cater to these single issue voters and vote against sensible gun laws. In fact, even when you have vast majorities of Americans, including majorities of gun owners, who agree with sensible gun laws, but that when you have single issue voters, that really skews the equation. And so you combine those two things, and we have a country that alone in the world has this massive gun industry, and at the same time very little regulation of that industry.
Yeah, it's definitely something that, we know there's a lot to take in, especially with given Monday, we will have a new administration. And a lot of things have already been planned. A lot of things have been spoken that, you know, there's a possibility or probability thereof. And so I really want you all to take the time to, you know, share some of your thoughts on what we may see coming up this year, and what your thoughts are on how we can go about trying to navigate that. Lotta, if you want to go ahead and go.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of challenges coming with the new administration, at least as it pertains to immigration policy. I would say, I think taking a 30,000 foot view, I think media coverage in both Latin America and the United States should more specifically focus on this pipeline of firearms going from the United States to the Latin American region. Because those firearms do shape how the region, how people live in their countries, right? And this doesn't just happen. They don't just appear out of thin air. There's a direct link from the United States to the rest of the region. And so when we're asking the question of why are all these people coming to the southern border, there should be a direct link to that issue. Second, you know, related to that, just as drug trafficking, you know, has been interconnected when it comes to policy, you know, discussions around migration, firearms should be interlinked with the discussion of migration, right? Because they are fundamental to shaping the discussion of migration, both in what happens in all of these countries and what happens to migrants throughout the journey. And as John, both Johns have expressed, there are enormous businesses that are being made and fueled, right, from very few industries that are profiting, like the firearms and firearm industries. But then there's billions and billions of dollars being generated in trafficking of people, trafficking of drugs, trafficking of you name it, right? And all of the corruption that generates. And a lot of people profit from that. So I think questions about who profits are also germane to what people should talk about. And then I guess finally, I am a public health person, right? And more conversations should focus on how public health, there are enormous public health and societal costs for the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean to this amount of violence, right? You have generations of children traumatized, and that affects learning, that affects potential for earnings down the line. There's all sorts of literature that links all of these very, very harmful impacts of all of this violence to our public health, to our productivity, to our mental health. And so, you know, backing up, we have to ask ourselves the question of, is this societal cost worth it for the profit of the very few who are profiting from these very large markets of firearms? So I'll leave it there.
John, you want to go next?
Sure, and also just addressing some of these other questions that I'm seeing, you know, in the chat. I do think it's just so important, as we all are trying to do, to link the problem of guns to migration, to fentanyl, to gang violence. I mean, the cartel's reach is spreading in, throughout U.S. communities more and more. And, you know, and we've all got to make that connection that, you know, in my view, none of these problems would be happening if you didn't have this trafficking pipeline from the U.S. into Mexico. You wouldn't have the violence in Mexico that drives migration. You wouldn't have the cartel power that enables fentanyl trafficking. You wouldn't have the cartels expanding their reach into the U.S. And, you know, those are issues that sort of cut across partisan politics. You know, I mean, there's people who voted for Donald Trump who care a lot, maybe have very different perspectives on the migration issue, but they do not want violence in Mexico that's going to drive migration. They do not want fentanyl trafficking. They have firsthand experience, like many of us, of the problem of opioid abuse and fentanyl. And so I do think, those issues, you can have this tremendous popular support that we need to do something about it. And then if they understand that guns are linked to that, we could really move the needle politically, even though in my view, I think what we really need to do is work outside the political system, in the courts, public advocacy, human rights, and that sort of thing.
And I would add a couple other things to what Laura and John have said. Yesterday, Marco Rubio had his Senate confirmation hearing for Secretary of State, and there was discussion about designating criminal organizations in Mexico as terrorist organizations, something that Republicans have been promoting for some time now. And logically, I mean, I don't think it's a good idea. Logically, if that occurred, then those entities that are selling arms that are then being used by those criminal organizations could be charged with aiding terrorism. Much more likely in this political climate is that people who are seeking asylum and traveling through Mexico in an environment where human movement is run by criminal organizations, and therefore people need to pay someone in order to get to safety and pay a criminal organization, those are going to be the people who would be criminally prosecuted for aiding terrorism. So I think this needs to be brought to light in all the conversations and debates about this. I don't think that prosecution, as in declaring these organizations as terrorist organizations, is really the answer. The answer is regulating the market. It's not that we want gun dealers to be put in a cell. It's that we want the market to be regulated. And so that means the types of weapons that are available that are certainly desired, like 50 caliber rifles that are especially desired by criminal organizations. There have no conceivable use by any civilian within the United States, and they're highly desired by narco trafficking organizations. They should be prohibited, and there is legislation proposed in order to do so. The second thing I would say is that the Trump administration is likely to liberalize gun exports. In the very last year, the Biden administration implemented some new restrictions on gun exports to non-governmental end users. This did not affect Mexico particularly, but it did affect Central American countries, Caribbean countries, and a number of other countries. In the case of Guatemala, for example, which is another source of a large number of people seeking asylum in the United States, the number of U.S. gun exports to Guatemala in the last 5 years has grown enormously. And that has fed a lot of the trade, the illicit trade within Guatemala, that has made life unsustainable for people in Guatemala and has led them to flee. Since July, the number of U.S. gun exports to Guatemala and to some other countries has gone practically down to zero. I would expect that the Trump administration will reverse that rule and will likely export more weapons in environments where those weapons are likely to be diverted and trafficked and used by criminal groups or others. It can be domestic abuse and can be other types of violence that will again drive more migration towards safe harbors. So that's something to look at. It's also something to advocate against, because this new rule, although it took the Biden administration more than 3 years to implement, to get to it, I think is making a difference and something we should pay attention to.
Yeah, that's it's a lot. It's a very complex it's a very complex issue, but definitely it's going to take all of us, right? And really identifying why it is that what exactly all of these root causes are. There's so much going through my mind that I want to say, and I know we've got such limited time. But I do want to, address the root cause issue, right? We know that when there are a lack of resources, a lot of times that can increase the influx of violence. We know that. We've seen that in community violence happening across our country. This is one of the reasons that we have so many community-based organizations who are from these communities, who can connect with these communities to be able to help bring those resources in, whether it be housing, food shortages, food deserts in some of these communities, lack of access to after-school care, mentors for education, after school activities for youth. But what we also see in communities, and we've found this across the country here in the United States, is what they are giving access to, right? A lot of times in some of our urban communities, our Black communities, Latino communities, you can come across a liquor store on every corner before you can come across an H-E-B, for those of you that live in Texas. For those of you that live elsewhere, a Publix, a Kroger, a Randall's, whatever it may be. Those are one of those identifying root causes. Another factor of that, you can find a gun store in the United States in each and every one of these communities. If not a gun store, you can find a pawn shop that will sell firearms, that has the ability to sell firearms in some of these communities. So when to me, what I see and when I think about, my family that, is still over in Mexico, is instead of, they only have, from what I understand, one gun store that is on an army base that you have to go through all of these different, these different points and checks. What's happening is they are now becoming available in the backs of cars, in back alleys, through these other individuals. And so each of those root causes really do have to be identified and have to be, there has to be a solution to that. Something that we can take those firearms out of the hands of those individuals and give them exactly what it is that they need, that has caused them to feel they need to resort to violence or resort to criminal activity. So just wanted to most definitely kind of extend that into, extend those root causes into what we see every day in our lives here in the States, that is now a problem that we are passing over across our borders. Something else that I see so much in the in the chat is really talking about these different laws. Why does Arizona have lax gun laws? Why do we in Texas, unfortunately, have lax gun laws? Then we have some other states that, are really putting forth the effort to curb these acts of violence that are happening, and even more so, curb the trafficking within our own borders of here in the United States. So I want to give this to the panelists, on what more can we do to really change that narrative, and give the proper narrative, I would say, on, how we can go about fixing this problem here in our United States that would then help to curb what's happening there across the border in Mexico and in South America. Anyone can jump in.
So I know John's going to have to run, but I'll just say the research is very clear that the federal assault weapons ban, which extended from 1994 to 2004, was critical not only in reducing the number of mass shootings within the United States, it also coincided with a reduction of gun homicides within Mexico. And then after it expired in 2004, the number of gun homicides in Mexico increased, particularly in the U.S. border states. And there's a particular study that shows that the gun homicides increased in the states across from Arizona and Texas, but not across from California because California maintained a state level assault weapons ban. So these state level gun regulation policies are really important for their impacts in Mexico as well as in the United States. And I think that's just super important to see that, you know, we can continue to act even when federal level actions are blocked. We have an all Republican majority in Congress as well as in the White House. And so ensuring that the narrative and the conversations that happen about these issues center the really constructive actions to reduce gun violence, as well as working in our own communities at the state and local level when federal actions are blocked.
I'll add directly to that point. I mean, if you really think about it, again, you take a 30,000-foot view, Latin America has been poor forever, right? So you have to ask yourself the question of like, why this massive influx of people fleeing the region? And the answer is the availability of firearms and the flow of firearms. You know, I mean, it's not just one thing, but it is such a big part of the firepower makes it all that more dangerous, right? And that is what makes it that kind of tips the scale, right? For many of the people that I talk to, the tipping point is the gang was going to recruit and kill my son. I was threatened by the police who were armed, and they were, so the tipping point almost always comes down to that near-death experience or that threat to your life. And that is why people decide to leave. And so, and it's not like people all of a sudden just take up machetes and start killing each other, right? So you really have to like really string this very logical argument of if the region has been poor and all else being equal, there's been migration forever, why do we see these influxes as the region is more and more violent, right? Has become more and more violent. And the answer is pretty linked to that direct increase in firepower and in lethality that is coming through the firearms that are coming from the United States, that are being trafficked from the United States for the most part. John.
I mean, just real quick, I mean, you know, like we're all doing, I think everyone should be informed, be armed with knowledge, and always make these connections of how guns, U.S. guns, are driving these other, you know, problems and issues. And, you know, we just need to, you know, when we hear about cartel violence, when we hear about the migration issue talked about, when we hear about fentanyl, just, you know, raise how guns are driving this, how this could not happen without U.S. guns. And if, you know, if we could take U.S. guns out of the equation by reforming the gun industry or stronger policies, you know, we would reduce the violence in our neighboring states, in our neighboring countries. We would, you know, defang the cartels. We would reduce fentanyl trafficking.
Very well said, John. That was a perfect way to close us out. I want to thank everybody for taking the time, spending the time with us to hear from these amazing experts. All of our organizations' emails have been put in the chat and will likely be in the follow-up email with resources, as well as a very quick survey. You know, this is a really great opportunity for us to continue that education and make those connections with individuals and find out a little bit more. This is an ever-changing world. So is the you know, issues that are coming up, but so are the solutions. So again, I want to thank our panelists. I know Jonathan already left. Thank you so much, John and Lara, for your commitment to this work, the commitment to saving lives. You know, I just hope that everyone stays safe, stay optimistic. We are the game changers in this world, in our families and in our communities. And we have the power to continue to spread love, spread peace, spread education, and make this world a better place for the generations to come. So thank you all.
Thank
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for joining in today, and we will try to follow up shortly. Thank you.